there's an objection I receive when I give my view about divorce and remarriage. My view is that when two people get married, they are married for life. That's a fact, not just an aspiration. And so that if they get divorced, God views them as still being married, so that if one of them remarries after a divorce, that remarriage is adultery, as Jesus explains in Matthew 5, Matthew 19, Mark 10, and Luke 16. The remarriage is adultery. It's a continual state of adultery. They should divorce that remarriage. I don't believe there are any exception clauses. I have other videos about that. The exception clause, I think, is referring to an invalid marriage that wasn't valid in the first place. But here's what I want to talk about is a particular objection that I get. When I explain my view to people, they'll say, well, what about polygamy in the Old Testament? And additionally, they may ask another question that's related, which is, didn't Jesus say in Matthew 5 that he's not changing any part of the law? I want to provide you with responses to these objections. Their argument goes like this. Polygamy was permitted in the Old Testament. God does not change. Polygamy, therefore, must be allowed in the New Testament. Divorce and remarriage is polygamy, except for the divorce step. Therefore, just as polygamous marriages did not need to be divorced, so remarriages do not need to be divorced. All right, so that's their basic argument. Or they might say this, something a little bit different. Divorce and remarriage was allowed in the Old Testament. The law does not change. Divorce and remarriage must be allowed in the New Testament. Both objections have to bridge the gap between the Old Testament and the New Testament in order for the argument to stand. And that's where the problem is. That the reality is there was a substantial change between the Old and the New, and we're going to get into that in a moment. But first, we want to get into some facts, some preliminary stuff. First, the Old Testament definitely included polygamy. You got Abraham and Jacob and David and Solomon and many others. So it definitely included polygamy. Second, there's some Old Testament texts that are alleged to give moral approval to polygamy. So whereas with Abraham, Jacob, Solomon, David, etc., that refers to what happened. Like it's just describing these are the facts of what happened. That's different than giving approval. But some people say, well, I have some other texts that give actual approval for polygamy. So for example, they'll point to 2 Chronicles chapter 24, where it refers to a king named Joash, and it said that he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord all the days of Jehoiada the priest, and Jehoiada got for him 2 wives, and he had sons and daughters. And the idea is, well, if what he did was right in the eyes of the Lord, and he had 2 wives, having 2 wives must be right in the sight of the Lord. But the problem is 2 Chronicles 24 is not saying that Joash was a perfect person and everything he did was right. In fact, in 2 Kings chapter 12, it talks about the same guy, and it says that he had the high places were not taken away by the same guy. And this is right after it said that he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. And like the very next verse says, actually, not everything was right in the eyes of the Lord, but it's more like in general, things were right in the eyes of the Lord, his reign and what he did. But the very next verse says the high places were not taken away. So the fact that he had 2 wives is not proof that it was given moral approval. Now, another argument people will bring up is they'll say, well, God is married to the church. You have Christ in the church, right? And the church is made up of lots of people. And they'll say, so this is a paradigmatic example of marriage. And since it's God and many people, therefore polygamy must be morally permissible. But if you look at the texts that talk about this, like Ephesians 5, the church is referred to as the bride of Christ in the singular, not the plural. So it's an analogy between marriage and Christ in the church. And in that analogy, the bride is singular, even though, yes, we know the church is made up of lots of people. We understand that. But in the analogy, the bride is singular. So actually, the paradigmatic example of Christ in the church supports monogamy, not polygamy. Another text people like to bring up who want to say the Old Testament gave moral approval to polygamy is in 2 Samuel chapter 12. This is the famous passage where Nathan rebukes David. Nathan the prophet rebukes David the king for killing Uriah the Hittite and taking his wife. And so starting in verse 7, Nathan said to David, "You are the man, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel. I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you out of the hand of Saul, and I gave to your master's house and your master's wives into your arms, and gave you the house of Israel and Judah. And if this were too little, I would have added to you as much more. Why have you despised the word of the Lord to do what is evil in his sight?" And so people will say that Nathan is telling David that God would have given you more wives. Now, he could have meant more land, but let's just stipulate for the moment that what Nathan meant was that God would have given David more wives. Nathan's point was not that more wives is a good thing. Nathan's point is you had to go kill a guy and take his wife. You took his wife first and then killed him. But the point is you had to go basically murder this guy, morally, impermissibly go kill this guy, and so you could have his wife. If you wanted more women, God would have allowed you to have more women. That was what Nathan's point was. You didn't have to go kill the guy for that. So people will say, well, but God would have given him more, so God must approve of it, or else God wouldn't cause him to then have more wives if God thought it was wrong. But that's just a wrong understanding of viewing God in causation as people do things. So let me give you an example. We read in Genesis that Joseph says to his brothers that you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. So there, Joseph was sold into slavery, and his brothers feel bad about it. And anyway, so Joseph says, well, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. Well, wait a minute. That means there's two people who are causing it. There's God who caused it and the brothers who caused it, right? But in God's causation, God meant it for good and they meant it for evil. So does that mean it is morally permissible to go sell people into slavery? Of course not. Nobody makes that argument. Or for example, look at Job. Job, his family and everything is attacked by people. And you could say that those bad people caused terrible things to happen to Job. You could say that Satan caused it, or you could say that God caused it. But does that mean that therefore it was permissible for them to do it? No. The sin is in the bad motive of the bad people who did the thing. So for example, Jesus was killed, but the people who killed him sinned in doing it. But it was still predestined for it to happen. So that does not, because God causes a thing to happen in a sense, that does not mean that God approves of the behavior. Or for example, God allowed nations to conquer Israel, but then he judged those nations for doing it. So it's a deep question about God's will, but the point of the matter here is God allowing something to happen does not mean God approves of it. So Nathan's point is not that, oh, you should have more wives. His point was God would have allowed him to have more wives, but that wasn't good enough for David. Nathan's point was, look how ridiculous it is that you got to go have this woman. God would have allowed you to have other women and he would have tolerated that. But no, you had to have this one and you had to go kill her husband. That's what Nathan's point was. Third, people point to the Mosaic Law. They'll say the Mosaic Law permitted polygamy by regulating it. And that's true. So for example, in Exodus 21, there's a guy gets a slave and he makes her his wife. And it says in verse 10 of Exodus 21, if he takes another wife to himself, so it's a second wife, he shall not diminish her food, clothing, or her marital rights. And if he does not do these three things for her, she shall go out for nothing without payment of money. So he gets the first wife, it's a slave wife, then he gets a second wife, and then he wants to neglect the first wife. And Moses puts a limit on how bad this behavior gets. It's bad enough you took on a second wife. Now you're going to neglect the first one? No, I don't think so. If you do that, she's out. She's out. She can leave for free. That's the regulation that Moses is putting on this practice of polygamy because, again, Moses is passing these government laws which are there to restrain the excesses of the people. If they're going to do these immoral things, he's going to regulate. He's going to throw some red tape at it. He's going to make it a little bit more difficult to do. Deuteronomy 21:15 says, if a man has two wives, the one loved and the other unloved, and both the loved and the unloved have borne him children. And if the firstborn son belongs to the unloved, then on the day when he assigns his possessions as an inheritance to his sons, he may not treat the son of the loved as the firstborn in preference to the son of the unloved, who is the firstborn. You can't change the rules about the firstborn getting inheritance and all that kind of stuff because he loves one wife more than another wife. Another regulation Moses is putting on the people. So now you might think, isn't polygamy adultery? If so, don't adulterers get capital punishment in the Old Testament? And the answer to that is capital punishment was for most, but not all kinds of adultery. Deuteronomy 22:22 says, if a man is found lying with the wife of another man, both of them shall die. The man who lay with the woman and the woman, so shall you purge the evil from Israel. So if a married woman has sex with a man, that's adultery, capital punishment. But suppose you have a married man who has sex with a single woman. That was not under the prohibition on adultery in Deuteronomy 22. Now, is it adultery for a married man to have sex with a single woman? Yes, it is. But is it punishable by death in the Old Testament law? No, it was not. So they made a distinction. Why did Moses make that distinction? Because it's a governmental law. He's passing this in light of their hardness of hearts. He's limited in how many laws he can pass and how far they can go. And they're a patriarchal culture. So if he pushes it too far, they'll depose him. There'll be a breakdown in the rule of law. And then what you're going to end up is with a worse legal regime. So he's going as far as he can go while still making sure he retains power and can enforce at least these laws. He's taking it as far as he can go, given the hardness of heart of the people he has to deal with. So now when objectors bring up polygamy, the conversation is like an onion with many layers you have to peel back. It's like when a kid asks why, and then you answer, and they ask why again, and you answer, and they ask why again, and at some point you realize, listen, I'm not Wikipedia. I'm not going to do this all day long, so you distract them. But anyway, that's what happens with this question. There's lots of layers. So we have to go through the layers of this onion. Because there are so many layers, there's a lot of opportunities to kind of get confused. So let's go through the layers. Layer number one, the objector asks, Moses allowed it, and David did it. Why do you say we cannot do polygamy? And one answer is, well, those passages tell us what occurred, but not what God approved. It's descriptive, not prescriptive. All right, and so Christians might bring up Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 14 through 17, when it says, when you come to the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and you possess it, and you dwell in it, and then you say, I will set up a king over me, like all the other nations that are around me. You may indeed set up a king over you, whom the Lord your God will choose. One from among your brothers you shall set up as a king over you. You may not put a foreigner over you who is not one of your brothers. Only he must not acquire many horses for himself, or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire many horses, since the Lord God has said to you, you shall never return that way again. And he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. So some Christians will say, listen, there's some shade thrown at polygamy here for the king, and the king is supposed to be, the example for everybody else. And if he can't have many wives, then we shouldn't have many wives either. And people who are on the other side will say, well, it says many wives, it doesn't say more than one. It also says you can't have many horses. Does that mean only the king can only have one horse or one piece of silver? Or whatever. So people will kind of dispute all of that. But I think it's pretty clear that Deuteronomy 17 is saying the king can have one wife and not many wives. All right, that's what I think. But anyway, that's a passage people will bring up. All right, layer two of this onion. The objector will say, well, David still went to heaven despite being a polygamist. So people can't go to heaven now if they're polygamous? And the answer is that's correct. Today, a polygamist cannot go to heaven. The reason is there was a change in the law, which changed the kind of conduct that was tolerated for the people who are heaven bound. Okay, so Mark 10, verse 11, Jesus said, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. So a man who divorces and remarries commits adultery. Well, if a man who divorces and remarries commits adultery, then that means he's cheating on his first wife despite the divorce. So if there is a divorce and a remarriage, it's adultery. Certainly without a divorce, a second marriage is adultery. It's the same thing. The point is he's cheating against his first wife. He's committing adultery against her. So if a divorce and remarriage is adultery, certainly just a remarriage would be adultery. So there was a change in the law, which is why in the Old Testament it was tolerated, in the New Testament not tolerated. All right, so here's layer number three. The objector will say, but didn't Jesus base his teachings on in the beginning? If so, is that a change to the law, or is it a restoration of the law? The Old Testament tolerated polygamy. The New Testament does not tolerate polygamy because there's a change in the law. That's my view. This objection says, but wait, how could you say there's a change in the law because Jesus is just saying in the beginning? So this prohibition on polygamy must have always been there. Therefore, it must have been prohibited in the Old Testament. But how could it be prohibited in the Old Testament if David went to heaven? So here's the answer to that. Jesus did base his teaching on in the beginning. You see that in Matthew 19 and Mark 10. But Jesus' teaching was a change in the law in the sense that it's clearer than Genesis. So it's not. I am not saying that there wasn't shade thrown. There wasn't like negativity toward polygamy in the Old Testament. There definitely was, but it wasn't as clear cut as when Jesus said it in the New Testament. That's the sense in which there's a change in the law. It was always immoral to have polygamists or to divorce and remarry. That was always wrong, and you saw glimpses of that in the Old Testament. But in the New Testament, it is crystal clear, and in that sense, it's a change in the law. Now, if you read the Mosaic Law carefully, you'll see these glimpses. Deuteronomy 24, 1 through 4, Moses says a remarriage defiled the woman. And so that threw shade at remarriage. Additionally, the polygamous marriages were portrayed in a negative light in the Old Testament over and over and over again. So while there wasn't a prohibition stated in the Mosaic law against polygamy, if you read the Old Testament and you don't get the concept that polygamy is bad, you're just someone who can't take a hint. This is like the guy who asks out a girl and says, hey, do you want to go to a coffee shop on Tuesday? And she says, oh, no, not Tuesday. I have to wash my hair. And did she say, I will never go out with you? No, she did not. But can you take a hint? It's very clear she's more interested in washing her hair than she is going out with you for coffee. If she really liked you, she'd probably go with you for coffee. Okay, that's how that works. So people can't take a hint when they read the Old Testament, and it's very clearly negative about polygamy. So here's the point: if you read the Old Testament with an eye to what pleases God, rather than what can I get away with, then you'll see polygamy is wrong. So the issue isn't that the text is really all that unclear in the Old Testament. The problem is that the eye of the reader is unclear in the Old Testament because they don't want it to say that they can't do polygamy. Here's layer number 4. The objector will say, so it was wrong in the Old Testament, but in a less clear way. But it was still wrong and at David's time, and he still went to heaven. So even if it's wrong today, why can't we still go to heaven as David did when he practiced polygamy, or if we were to do remarriage? And the answer is there's 2 types of understanding with what we're saying when we say it was wrong. Okay, so yes, it was wrong from the beginning to remarry. It was wrong from the beginning to do polygamy. And there are strong hints of polygamy and remarriage are wrong in the Old Testament. But it wasn't prohibited in a legal way in the Old Testament, in a nice, clear, legal way. During the Old Testament, it was wrong, but it was tolerated. In the New Testament, it is wrong and not tolerated. So Jesus' formulaic language in Matthew 5, Matthew 19, Mark 10, Luke 16 are additions to the law as law. So there is a change to the law, despite the fact that polygamy and remarriage were always wrong, and you had glimpses of it in the Old Testament. All right, now we get to layer number 5. This is a more sophisticated objection, and they quote Matthew 5, 17 through 20, and some other passages, which I'm going to get into right now. So first, Matthew 5, verses 17 through 20. Jesus says, for truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do so will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Luke 16, 16 through 17. The law and the prophets were until John. Since then, the good news of the kingdom is preached, and everyone forces his way into it. But it is easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one dot of the law to become void. Matthew 24, 35. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Now, also consider Hebrews chapter 7, 11, and 12. The writer of Hebrews writes, now, if perfection had been attainable through the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, what further need would there have been for another priest to arise after the order of Melchizedek, rather than the one named after the order of Aaron? For when there is a change in the priesthood, there is necessarily a change in the law as well. So the change from the Old Testament to the New Testament is a challenging doctrinal topic, but I want to mention a few things preliminarily. First, I don't think it's permissible to take a topic that is like less clear like this, the change from the old to the new, and create some kind of dogmatic conclusion about it, and then use that to try to reinterpret Jesus' words on remarriage, which are clear. All right, so you don't want to use the unclear doctrine or whatever to reinterpret clear text from the scripture. Second, the question about the changing of the law and all that is often confused when you get to Paul's writings. People don't quite know how do you handle the law and the faith and all that kind of stuff. So I understand Paul to say that those who repent and believe are forgiven, and they're not under the condemnation of the law, and they're not under the law, but they have been changed by their faith, because the faith that saves you is the faith that changes you, and therefore they want to live according to the law. They have a new nature. They want to do that. So they're dead to the law, but they also live by the law because they naturally just want to. So it's just the reason that they live by the law isn't because they're trying to go to heaven by the law. Rather, they just naturally have an inclination to live in a way that's pleasing to God because they want to do that. Okay, but that all of that stuff with Paul, that doesn't really actually address whether and how the law changed from the Old Testament to the New Testament. So that's what we want to get into here. We want to talk about Jesus and the law. Jesus did not subtract from the Old Testament law. Jesus added to the law. In general, when two laws conflict, the higher law overrides the lower law. Jesus' additions to the law overrode some lower laws in the Old Testament. Therefore, Jesus changed some permissions, prohibitions, and requirements of the law, not by repealing old permissions, prohibitions, or requirements, but by overriding them. All right, so this argument that I just made requires me to provide evidence for a couple of claims. The first claim is that Jesus added to the law, and the second one is that the higher laws override lower laws. So I read to you Hebrews earlier, and it says that there was a change to the law, and we cannot therefore read the New Testament text to mean that there is no change. So some people, they read Matthew 5:17-20. Jesus says not one iota will pass from the law, and so they go, okay, well, Jesus says I'm not going to abolish the law, and they say therefore the law did not change. But that's not what Jesus said. Jesus said he did not abolish, he did not remove. Jesus could add. If Jesus added, that in no way contradicts what he says in Matthew 5:17-20, number one. And number two, Hebrews says that the law did in fact change. So there is a change in some way. So there can be so the way there can be a change, but not an abolishment, is if Jesus adds rather than Jesus removes. So, for example, there's obviously a change. We're not sacrificing animals anymore. We can eat bacon. Jesus disfavors taking oaths. Circumcision is no longer required. We're not doing Passover or the many other holidays on the Jewish calendar. We don't keep the purity laws. There was definitely a change to the law. Jesus says, don't think I've come to abolish law. I've not come to abolish, but to fulfill. And the word fulfill here is very interesting. The word fulfill can have two different meanings. One meaning of the word fulfill is to do the thing, right? And another one is to complete, right? So one is to do and one is to complete. So let me give you an example. Suppose I have a grocery list and I have 8 things on my grocery list, and I say I fulfilled the list. Then it's kind of a strange way for us to talk, but if I were to say I fulfilled the list, what that means is that could mean I went to the grocery store and I picked up the 8 items. I did the list. Or it could mean I looked at my list of 8 things and I remembered, aha, there's 2 more things I don't have on the list, and I added them to the list. Now the list is done. It's complete. I still have to go pick up the stuff, but at least I have the 10 things I need to pick up on my grocery list. Now, I think what Jesus meant when he said fulfill was he was saying that he's adding to the law. I didn't come to abolish. I came to fulfill. I came to complete. I came to complete the list of laws. So the idea is, say you have a vase and it's half full of water, and then you come by with more water and you fill it up to the brim. Now you have fulfilled the vase. You've filled it all the way up. Check out this use of that same Greek word that's translated fulfill and there in Matthew 5. So in Matthew 13:47, it says, again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was thrown into the sea and gathered fish of every kind. But when it was full, the men drew it ashore and sat down and sorted the good into containers, but threw away the bad. So the word full, when the net is full, that's the same word as fulfill. That means it was, at one point, it was a quarter full, then it was half full, then it was 3/4, then it was totally full. And then they pulled it out of the ocean, so the sea. So the point is totally full, right? And so with the law is the object that's being talked about there. The law was, he's not abolishing, he's fulfilling. So he's making the law full, is one way to understand fulfill in Matthew 5. That's how I understand it. So now, why say anything about abolish and fulfill? What's the point of any of that? Well, if you look at Matthew chapter 5, Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is about to talk about a lot of different law type things. And he is anticipating, I think, an objection that's going to come from the Pharisees. The Pharisees are going to say, oh, look, he's trying to take away the Mosaic law. And the Pharisees they think of themselves as Mosaic centric. And so they're sure to object. Jesus is subtracting from the law. They will say that permissions and the prohibitions and the requirements are being removed, or they're being abrogated, or they're being abolished by Jesus' teaching. And so that's the characterization that they're going to make. And so Jesus says, I'm not abolishing, I am adding. And so the Pharisees are going to say that Jesus is anti-law because they think he's subtracting from the law. But Jesus, and if you read that portion there in Matthew 5:17-19, Jesus is saying that the Pharisees are anti-law because they are not adding Jesus' law, which is going to fulfill the law. That's why Jesus says your righteousness must exceed that of the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees. So he turns the tables on them. They're going to say that he's detracting from the law, and he's saying, no, you're detracting from the law. But what do we do about the fact that we're saying he's adding to the law, but the result of that is permissions, prohibitions, and requirements of the Old Testament are no longer binding. How is that possible, right? So if you have a law that says if you come to a red light, you have to stop, how is it I can add another law, and adding that law makes it so that I can now go through the red light? That doesn't make any sense. You think maybe I could have to stop more often, or I'd have to drive slower, or there'd be other prohibitions on my conduct, but you wouldn't think that adding a law would give me a permission to do something that previously was prohibited. And that's where we have to understand the concept of overrides in the law. So for example, with this red light example, suppose you have a red light and they have the traffic system, and then a little while later this town realizes, oh, you know what, we better make a law that allows police and ambulances and fire trucks to go through red lights. And so they pass a law that says, well, you can go through the red lights. And they added another law. Well, when they added that law, they kind of overrode the red light law. Now, normally when we write those kinds of laws, what we do is we write an exception. We say you have to stop the red light unless you're a police officer and you're chasing somebody or whatever. We have exceptions written into the law. But overrides work very similar to the idea of an exception. So once you have the idea with an override is you have law 1 and you have law 2. If it turns out that law 2 is a higher law than law 1, then when law 2 and law 1 come into conflict, law 2 wins. So if law 1 prohibits conduct and law 2 requires conduct and law 2 is more important, then law 2 wins, and you can't use law 1 to tell somebody they can't do what law 2 requires, if that makes sense. Let me give you an example of that. Matthew 12, verses 1 through 5. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry, and they began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. But when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath. He said to them, have you not read what David did when he was hungry? Those who were with him, how he went into the house of God and ate the bread of the presence, which was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but they're only there for the priests? Or have you not read in the law how on the Sabbath the priests are in the temple, profane the Sabbath, and are guiltless? So the idea is with the priests, they have to do sacrifices, but they cannot work on the Sabbath. Doing a sacrifice is definitely work. I mean, it's a lot of work, but it's the Sabbath. So what do you do when those come into conflict? And the answer is you sacrifice. Why? Because the sacrificial law was a higher law than the Sabbath law. So therefore they're breaking the law, but it's permissible because there's another law that overrides. So you have to understand this concept of override. So that's the reason why Jesus can add laws, and those are going to override old laws, and that's not abolishing the law, that's overriding the law, which is a different concept, and it's a very important distinction. Now you might think that sounds like a cute logical bit of gymnastics to make it sound like you're adding to the law, but in effect you're really just subtracting to the law. So you could say, well, that sounds like a difference without a distinction. You're saying it's addition, it's not really subtraction, but the effect is the same as subtraction. And so you might think that's cute, but that can't be what it means. But I want to push back on that. A removal of a law would allow somebody to do something that's wrong. An addition with a higher law does not allow somebody to do a wrong thing. So let me explain it this way visually, and this will show you the difference between a removal and the addition that overrides. There is a huge difference here. Suppose you're on a beach, and on this beach there are 3 umbrellas installed into the sand, and they give some shade into the sand. Okay, now a person comes and they remove an umbrella, and they leave. That person removed the umbrella, right? And now the effect is what? The effect is there's 1/3 less shade in the sand. So that would be abolishing the law, removing the umbrella, right? That's the idea. Okay, now let's take another example. There's 3 umbrellas in the sand, and somebody comes and they put up a much larger umbrella. And now that much larger umbrella casts a shadow that's very large, and it casts a shadow over the 3 umbrellas that are already there and a lot more land. Right? So now that larger umbrella, it's a bigger umbrella, it's a more important umbrella. It supersedes, it overrides the other umbrellas, but it does not take away from the law. It prohibits more immoral conduct, not less. So a removal of a law would permit more immoral conduct. The overriding of laws with a higher law permits less immoral conduct. So when Jesus says, I'm not here to abolish the law, what Jesus is saying here is, I'm not here to loosen the standards, I'm here to raise the standard. And that makes a lot more sense. If you read Matthew chapter 5, Jesus is raising the standard one after another there throughout the Sermon on the Mount. All right, so those are all the layers. I want to talk about some of the effects of this. So today, in conservative evangelicals, most of the missionaries we have discussed this idea. What are we going to do about polygamy? So you go over to another country and you preach the gospel, and a guy and his 3 wives, they all claim to be saved, but you find out, oh, they're polygamous. Then what do? Well, what most conservative evangelical missionaries will do is they'll say, you have to stay with all 3 of your wives. You're all going to come in and take communion. And that's the idea with how they handle polygamy right now. And because of that, if polygamy became legal in America, and don't tell me it can't happen, there's a lot of things people told me can't happen. I'm not so sure I believe it. I think it could happen here with all the other things that have happened if you give it enough time. But if polygamy became legal here in America, conservative evangelicals, there's nothing we're going to be able to do to stop it. And we're actually going to run into this weird problem of how we're going to, I guess conservative evangelicals are going to say women can't have multiple husbands, but men can have multiple wives. And good luck with that. I have no idea where they're going to go with that, because the Old Testament polyandry, a woman with multiple husbands, was not allowed. So I don't know how they would wrestle with that, because they're going to cross that bridge when they come to it. I think the whole thing is a house of cards, personally. But anyway, because we say you can divorce and remarry and you don't have to divorce the adulterous remarriage, conservative evangelicals then also tolerate polygamists being church members and claiming that they're saved and all that. So that's a real problem that we have in conservative evangelicalism. So for the most part, conservative evangelicals are just as permissive on polygamy as they are on divorce and remarriage. And the reason why they're equally permissive on both for the most part is because the force of the argument is pretty strong. If you're going to allow remarriages to continue, you're going to have to allow polygamy to continue. It's really difficult to kind of stop. And in fact, that's not just my opinion. Luther, who kind of championed the modern evangelical view on divorce and remarriage that he got from Erasmus, who probably got it from the Orthodox Church. Anyway, Luther was open to polygamy. He says, let me quote this from him. This is from his letter to Chancellor Gregory Bruck in January 13th, 1524. He says, I confess that I cannot forbid a person to marry several wives, for it does not contradict the scripture. If a man wishes to marry more than one wife, he should be asked whether he is satisfied in his conscience that he may do so in accordance with the word of God. In such a case, the civil authority has nothing to do with the matter, says Luther. The Anabaptists in Munster, they instituted polygamy for a period of time as well. Now, I will say this. Thankfully, we got somebody who pushed back on polygamy. That would be John Calvin. He said on his commentary on Malachi 2:16 that polygamy is worse than divorce and remarriage because it's cruel to the first wife. And so he seems to say the husband is morally obligated to divorce one of them, at least in the Old Testament period. And underlying the difference between Luther and Calvin on polygamy appears to be a disagreement about the nature of polygamous marriages. On the one hand, there was one idea that polygamous marriages must be valid because they were allowed in the Old Testament, so you can't stop them. On the other hand is this idea that polygamous marriages must be ongoing adultery and thus must be divorced. And so we already know that Moses allowed things that were not morally permissible, because Jesus says in Matthew 19:8 that he allowed divorce for hardness of heart. So Luther's assumption that if it was allowed in the Old Testament, it must be permissible in the New Testament just totally fails. I mean, Jesus says Moses allowed it for your hardness of heart, but I say to you like the opposite. So the idea that, they allowed it in the Old Testament, it must be permissible now, is just totally fails. So it seemed that Calvin was right, that polygamous marriages must be ongoing adultery and then therefore should be divorced. But if polygamous marriages are ongoing adultery and therefore should be divorced, aren't remarriages while a prior valid spouse is alive also continual states of adultery? I mean, yes, they are. Jesus calls it adultery to remarry, which means a person is still, from God's perspective, married to their first spouse after they get divorced and remarried. So the only difference between polygamy and the remarriage is just the divorce. And Jesus' whole point is the divorce doesn't do anything. The divorce doesn't make you not married. It is literally impossible to unspouse your spouse. You're married till death do you part. So since Jesus says the remarriage is adultery, the divorce didn't end the marriage between the first spouses, and therefore the remarriage is kind of like polygamy. That's why a remarriage while a prior valid spouse is alive is wrong. It's continual adultery, must be divorced. Now, I said remarriage is like polygamy. That's true, but I do want to make a distinction. So, like Calvin, I think polygamy is worse than divorce and remarriage. It's cruel to bring the adulteress into the house with you. I mean, if you don't, I mean, obviously it's worse to bring the woman in with the house with you, with the other wife. That's just over the top crazy. Okay, so that's really bad. All right, but nevertheless, in a technical sense, remarriage and polygamy are similar since in both cases a man is married to the first wife, but is living with a fake marriage with the second wife. Put in your comments, send me your emails at divorceyourremarriage@gmail.com. Go ahead and buy my book, Divorce Your Remarriage. You can get that at amazon.com. Make sure to subscribe, like, comment, all the things, and I'll see you next time.